It's extremely important if you want to understand what other people in other places are like. So I'll often have discussions with Americans and they'll say something about the Middle East or, something that's going on there. And my favorite thing is to always then say, when was the last time you were there? And the answer is almost always they were never there. It's just stuff you hear in the news. And I know firsthand, having been in the middle of several big news events, that what I then subsequently read in major media outlets was often wrong or misinterpreted, or they were spinning it in such a way to make it sound worse than it was. A couple examples. I was
I'd like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on a very interesting guest. He is one of the few people in the world who makes me feel like I have not done much traveling. He makes me feel like a very poorly traveled man because he's an extraordinarily well traveled man. He is a photographer, a blogger, and he is the host of the podcast Everything Everywhere. And this is Gary Arndt. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on, Gary. I've done a brief intro there, but for my listeners who are not familiar with you, please introduce yourself.
Okay, if you want the 2-minute summary, I was a competitive academic debater in college. I then started an internet company in the early 90s, managed to sell that before the dot-com bubble burst in 1998. Started a couple other companies that did not that did suffer the dot-com bubble burst. Went back to school for a few years, studied geology and geophysics, and realized I wanted nothing to do with academia, and came up with this idea of traveling around the world for a year. So I sold my house, put all my stuff in storage, and that 1 year turned out to be 13. And I kind of just never stopped traveling around the world. And during the course of doing that, I created a pretty popular blog and taught myself photography. I bought a very expensive camera when I started traveling that I didn't know how to use, thinking it would take good pictures automatically, and quickly found out that that's not how it worked. And taught myself, and to a point where I eventually was named Travel Photographer of the Year 3 times in North America. And then when the pandemic hit, within a span of like a couple weeks, I came home from my last international trip, February 28th, 2020, got COVID that first week. So I was an OG COVID guy. Then the entire travel and tourism industry fell apart in the middle of March of 2020. All my contracts that I had going, everything I had going for me just vanished because the whole industry disappeared. And at the time, a lot of us thought that this would be over with relatively quick. Like, oh, this will end, maybe in a month or so, which obviously didn't happen. And I realized I needed to make a pivot, and I launched Everything Everywhere Daily, a daily educational show. And now I'm talking to you.
I got it. Well, there's a lot to get into there. I'm curious. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Wisconsin to a family that was solidly middle class and never really traveled much. So one of the stories I always like to tell is that I never saw salt water until I was 21. And in fact, I was a senior in college, and we were going to the national debate tournament, which was in Bellingham, Washington. We flew into Seattle, and we were all in a van. And I remember we passed this park in Seattle, and I started shouting, "Stop, stop, stop." And like they thought there was an emergency, I opened the door and I ran out to taste the water so I could verify that it was actually salty, because I'd never seen salt water before.
That's funny. So what was it that made you decide to just go on this huge adventure traveling the world? Because especially as someone who didn't travel much in your youth, there are a lot of people who get to adulthood, and if they haven't traveled quite a bit already, they often, I mean, some people have a curiosity, but I find quite a lot of people have an aversion to it. They find that it's far too much outside their comfort zone. So, what made you want to go on that adventure, especially to the point of selling your house to do it?
I was always curious about things. Um, my dad had a subscription in National Geographic growing up that I read voraciously. My uncle was a custodian at a local school, and they would often get rid of their old issues. So I remember poring over, these issues from the 1960s and whatnot. And I became fascinated by a lot of these places that I never visited. When I sold my internet company in the 90s, I sold it to a large multinational corporation, and I conned them into sending me on an around the world trip to talk to all their offices about internet stuff. So I took a 3-week trip where I circumnavigated the globe, And I went to Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Frankfurt, Brussels, London, and Paris. And that was a real eye opening experience. And I really liked it because I especially remember my very first night was in Tokyo at this hotel near the airport. And I was jet lagged. So I stayed up all night and I was just going through the TV, just watching all this stuff. I couldn't understand any of it, but I was just fascinated by it because at the time, you couldn't see this stuff in the United States, like Japanese game shows and whatnot. Now you can watch anything anywhere because of the internet. But this was still very early on. And, your eyes are drawn to little things like how the light switches are different, how the electrical outlets are different, little tiny things that you just aren't aware of. And my mind was focused on all this stuff. And everywhere I went, I would notice all these little things. And I was also noticing a lot of the big things because I was able to do some sightseeing. And I just loved it. And that really stuck with me. And that was a big impetus behind the idea of wanting to travel.
Mm. That's awesome. So you've been to how many countries in total now?
Okay, that depends on how you define country. And I'm not being pedantic about it. So if it's just UN member states, I've been to 130. If you include things, but Antarctica is not a country. Gibraltar, French Polynesia, places like that are considered dependencies or territories of other countries. So if you include that, it's 203. Puerto Rico, I've been to every US territory. I've been to almost every French territory, almost every British territory. Um, yeah. And then a lot of, even you're in Dubai and the
That's right.
United Arab Emirates is a country, but in reality, each of the Emirates is kind of in some way its own country. They have a very unique system. So
Mm.
going to Dubai is not the same thing as going to Abu Dhabi. They're similar culturally, to be sure, but they kind of have their own laws in a way that other countries. So it really depends on how you look at it. But those are the numbers I usually give.
Yeah. How many had you been to when you decided to kind of just go all out? I mean, there must have been a certain number you had been to, and then you made a decision to consciously be like, all right, I'm going to make an effort to actually tick as many of these off as I can.
Uh, Before I started traveling full time in 2007, I had been to United States, Canada, the trip I previously mentioned. Went to the Bahamas with my girlfriend once. I took a trip to Iceland, and I took a research trip when I was studying geology down to Argentina. So less than 10.
And then, so after that, I mean, did you immediately decide, okay, I want to get to 200 plus countries and territories? Was that a goal right off the bat, or was it like you got to, I don't know, you got to 30 or 40 or 50, and then you thought, you know what, I've been to so many, let's really go for it.
I think that when I started, the expression "your eyes are bigger than your stomach," that you order more food than you can eat. When I started, I kind of had an idea that, I want to go here, I want to go here, I want to go here. And then when I started traveling, it kind of dawns on you just how big the world is. For example, it took me half a year when I started traveling to cross the Pacific Ocean. So I flew to Hawaii, learned to scuba dive. Then I went to Tahiti. The reason for Tahiti is because it let me go to Easter Island. Went back to Tahiti. Then I went to the Cook Islands, New Zealand, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, American Samoa, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands, Nauru, Kiribati. Then I went up to the north, went to Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, Palau, Northern Marianas Islands, and then the Philippines. And so that's just these tiny little places that a lot of people haven't even heard of, or if they've heard of it, they know nothing about it. And so I was literally by Christmas, I had gotten to Hong Kong, and I kind of realized this is going to take more than a year, but I wasn't planning on like 13 years like it ended up taking. I just hit a point eventually where I made life on the road sustainable. So I didn't have to worry about spending money. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when you travel full time, it's far cheaper than if you're just going on holiday. When people go on vacation, you're still paying for all your stuff at home. If you have rent or a mortgage, it's not like you get a break from that because you're not using your home for that period. You still have to pay it. So any traveling you do is in addition to what you're paying back home. But when you're traveling full time, your mortgage, your rent, your utilities, your insurance, fuel, everything else that you're spending is gone. And instead of that, you're getting lodging in sometimes much cheaper places if you're in, say, Southeast Asia or Central America, where you can, get by in very little. Food is much cheaper, and the ultimate cost is how fast you're traveling. So if you stay in a place for an extended period of time and you're not having to get plane tickets or things like that, then it can get real cheap. I knew a lot of people that were able to live on the road for $1,000 a month.
Yeah. Yeah, it's far less expensive than a lot of people think, particularly if you're just an individual. If you're just a single man or perhaps a single woman just traveling by yourself, then yeah, I mean, it's probably it. I mean, yeah, with the exception of a handful of regions, it's actually cheaper than it is, say, living in the U.S. or in Canada or Western Europe or whatever the case may be. It's really, I mean, from 2021, mid 2021 until March last year, I was kind of similar to you. I wasn't living anywhere. I gave up my apartment in the UK in June 2021, and this is when there were still all these restrictions going on and various lockdowns and shutdowns and so on. So I was just traveling around trying to avoid those and doing events in different places, and I was living a life of what I just called luxury homelessness for about 3 years. And I think a lot of people who are following me on social media are kind of looking at that like, oh my gosh, like I wish I had the money to do that, or it must be costing you this much or something. I was like, actually, no, it's not. It's actually surprisingly inexpensive. And I'm not someone who, I don't know. I don't need that much. If it's just me, I really don't need that much to get by. As you said, what is expensive is the actual travel itself, plane tickets, getting around like that. But once you're in most locations, it's yeah, it's relatively inexpensive. And I think here's something I'd love for you to speak on because I do talk about this a bit, and I have quite a lot over the years, which is just the importance and the value of traveling. And I'd especially love to hear this for you as an American because Americans do not travel internationally very much. I think to this day, even in 2025, I don't think most Americans even have a passport. British people do travel more than Americans do, at least internationally. So, why do you think that seeing the world is important?
It's extremely important if you want to understand what other people in other places are like. So I'll often have discussions with Americans and they'll say something about the Middle East or, something that's going on there. And my favorite thing is to always then say, when was the last time you were there? And the answer is almost always they were never there. It's just stuff you hear in the news. And I know firsthand, having been in the middle of several big news events, that what I then subsequently read in major media outlets was often wrong or misinterpreted, or they were spinning it in such a way to make it sound worse than it was. Um, Couple examples. I was in East Timor on the morning when there was an assassination attempt on both the president and the prime minister. I'm going back to the airport. There are military in the streets. There's Australian peacekeepers at the airport. And I didn't really know what was going on. The only thing that was said was the taxi driver that took me to the airport. He just goes bang bang, very bad, very bad. So I didn't know what he meant. But when we landed in Darwin in Australia, there was a police officer that came up to the plane and he told us what had happened. He said that the president and the prime minister were killed, which was not true. Um, but then I started following the story over the next couple of weeks. And one of the things I realized is that every story that was filed was like out of Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur or Singapore, which were way far away from East Timor. And they were kind of just providing these vague summaries of things and no real information. The other thing I was involved in 2010, I was in Bangkok when they had the red shirt protests. And this was a huge social movement. Hundreds of thousands of people came from outer Thailand. They were protesting. This one day, they were going to protest at the prime minister's house, which is a couple blocks from where I was staying. So I took my camera and I go out there and I photographed the whole thing. Terrifying yet exhilarating at the same time because it was me between hundreds of cops in riot gear and thousands of angry protesters. And I'm just a white dude with a camera. And but thankfully they had no beef with any foreigners. This was all against that. But I recall seeing journalists reporting with like helmets on, like it was a war zone, and it wasn't. Like if you were not in this one particular part of Bangkok, you would not have known that anything was happening whatsoever. It was business as usual everywhere. But they wanted to make it sound like this was, and like it was literally like, I'm going to put on the helmet for the report and then I take it off as soon as the camera stops rolling. So that's one of the biggest things is you need to understand the rest of the world and you get a very different perspective of things. I would often go places and people would say, "Oh, it's dangerous there." It's like, well, no, it's not, because the only thing they know is what they see in the media about a place if they haven't visited it themselves. And the only time the media reports on anything is if something bad happens. So you need to go yourself to figure this out. Uh, you're in Dubai. Have you been to Oman?
Not yet, but I'm very keen to
Oh,
go.
you got to
So,
go to Oman.
yeah, I definitely want to check it out. So, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I lived there for 20 years. I've been to Bahrain several times. I've been to Qatar a few times, and obviously, I live in the UAE. And before moving here, I'd been here many times, but I haven't been to Oman yet. But I just got a car recently, so I would love to do. I'd love to do a road trip down there
So
at some
the
point.
reason I bring up Oman is because I'll use Oman and Laos as an example. It's like
Okay.
what do you think of when you think of these places? And more often than not, they don't think of anything because they haven't been in the news. They have no idea. They may not even know it exists. If it's Laos, they may say something about the Vietnam War, which was half a century ago, because that's the last time anything of note happened there that would have got Western media attention. So I think being able to go and see many of these things firsthand and learn about places firsthand is extremely important. Now about the Americans traveling thing. Um, I once did an article on this. If you were to take I think it's a 1,000 kilometer circle centered on Prague, that circle will encompass parts of or the entirety of 32 different countries.
Wow.
You take that same circle and you put it on Kansas City, Missouri, you have not left the United States.
No.
So there is a qualitative difference between an American traveling and, say, someone British. That if you travel the same distance, you're going to, by definition, have to go to different countries.
Mhm.
The UK is the size of Alabama, I think. And a lot of people don't really understand the size of the United States. Before 9/11, you didn't need a passport to go to Canada, Mexico, and most of the Caribbean. So you could travel within the region without having a passport.
I didn't actually know that. So it was post 9/11 that you started to need a passport. Okay.
So that's why most Americans never had a passport because,
Mm.
and if you think about it, and I've seen studies that show that like, well, if you instead of looking at the number of countries someone visits, if you look at the distance they travel, the average distance, there's not a whole lot of difference between the average American and say the average German. The
Sure.
difference being is that when a German goes 500 kilometers, they're going to be in a different country, and an American probably isn't. And we only border two countries, despite the size of the country. It's Canada, Mexico, and that's it. And so, where do a lot of American tourists go? They're going down to Acapulco. They're going to Cancun. They're going to maybe some places in the Caribbean. And likewise, where are some of the biggest places for, say, British travelers? They're going to go.
Spain,
Yep.
France. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to go to those places that are within distance. I've been to, say, Mallorca, lots of British, the Canary Islands, British and Norwegians. Um, so when you look at it like that, uh, the travel distances are not really radically different. That being said, I do encourage everyone, especially Americans, to make the effort to leave the hemisphere.
I think part of the reason why it's so important, I agree with everything you said there. I think part of the reason why it's important as well is it gives you a better understanding of your own nation because you get more reference points. So as an American who has been to so many parts of the world, you have a comparison point. So you can see whether it's things you might prefer here, or an advantage of there, or something that's done better here or done better there. I find it just gives you lots of different reference points so that you have a more accurate. I consider it like having a higher resolution of the world and your own nation. So like you said, right? If you ask me, I haven't been to Laos, for example. So if you ask me, what about Laos? I might know some like very basic information. I know what general region it's in, but I have a very low resolution view of it. But if I were to go there, especially if I were to spend time, then you start to increase that resolution, and it happens not just for that individual nation, but I just find the wider picture, because oftentimes people will make a statement, and I like to ask compared to what. So even if someone says, "Oh, this place, this city, or this country is dangerous, or it's this, or it's that," it's like, well, compared to what? I know people who are I know people in the UK who are afraid to go to the USA because they say the USA is dangerous. And then there's people in the USA who are afraid to go to London because, again, what you were saying before about the stories that make the news, and they're there, "Oh, no, I've heard London is dangerous. I'm not going to go there." And it's just like,
What both of those have in common is that they're painting with a very broad brush. There are places in the United States where you probably shouldn't go, and it's certain neighborhoods. And there are places in the UK that you probably don't want to go, but there's certain neighborhoods. It's very concentrated. The problem is the further now when you live in that place, you know that's the bad part of town. This is the good part of town. You just know that. So when a crime happens, people aren't flipping out and moving. They just know, oh, that's just part of the life here. The further away you get from that, you lose that resolution. And so this neighborhood becomes this city or this country. And uh, one of the stats I saw is the highest murder rate in the world at one point. I think it was pretty recently, was in Honduras, but it wasn't Honduras. It was actually a couple neighborhoods in Tegucigalpa in the capital where there was a lot of gang activity. And that was responsible for the vast majority of the murders in the country. If you avoid those neighborhoods, your odds of being killed drop dramatically. In Mexico, there are people I know that were afraid to go to Mexico because of what was happening with the cartels. That was mostly happening in the north. If you go down to the Yucatan, the crime rate is about the same as Finland. And so people need to have that perspective on things. And you don't have that perspective unless you're actually on the ground.
curious to know, where has surprised you the most based on perhaps your assumptions and what you expected versus what it was like on the ground?
One of the things I've noticed, and I never even thought about this, is that the poorest countries have the least amount of beggars. Beggars tend to exist where there's a disparity between rich and poor, or where you have a lot of tourism. When I went to Sierra Leone, there were no beggars. In Haiti, I never saw any beggars because I don't think it would be tolerated by the people there because they're all in a not great situation. But when you go to say Cambodia, uh, there were a lot because there were tourists. And there was a fascinating story, and I don't know if this is true, but it's a great story. I was staying at a guest house in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and that day I had visited the Tulsang prison, which was this prison where they just murdered, I think, like 28,000 people. Like, people would come in, they were tortured, and then they never left. And it's this horror. It's like visiting Auschwitz. It's a very solemn place. So I'm visiting that place. I come back to the guest house I'm staying, and there's a British guy there. He says, "Oh, what did you do today?" I said, "I went to Tool Sang." And he had a smile on his face, which I thought was odd. And he said, "Well, did you see the guy outside that was begging?" And there was a guy outside, and his face had been horribly burned. He was horribly disfigured. And I think I gave him like a buck or two. And he said to me, continuing smiling, "Do you know why he's disfigured?" And I said, "No, but mentally I associated, I just saw this horrible place. This man has a horrible condition. I felt bad." And then he said, "Yeah, his wife threw battery acid on him because he was cheating on her." And again, he was able to use that to get money. And that's the kind of thing that probably would only exist in a country like that because they get so much international tourism. You'd never see that in other parts of the world that aren't nearly as well visited. So that was kind of surprising. Um, the level of development in most places. I think that there's a assumption that, especially maybe if you're American, that a lot of the rest of the world is poor. And there's a lot of the world that I would say is solidly middle class. They're not poor. Uh, they get by just fine. Maybe it's not quite the same level of development, but you're really talking about degrees at that point. I had people that thought like, oh, can you buy toothpaste and toilet paper in these countries? It's like, yeah, they have toothpaste. They have that everywhere. Uh, but people literally don't know that kind of stuff. And what a lot of people don't know is over the last 20 years, there has been an incredible increase in the reduction of extreme poverty throughout the world, where the number of people making, say, $1 a day has diminished dramatically, and that number of people living in the middle class around the world has increased substantially. And I was able to go places, and the dream in a lot of places is own a cell phone and maybe have a motorbike, which gives you communication and transportation, which are two things which can improve the standards of livings of people dramatically, even though most people in the West don't even think of those things. But if you've traveled around, you've probably seen lots of people's on scooters, and they tend to be Android phones, not iPhones, but even a simple phone can do wonders. In India, I read a report about a guy that was able to simply use his phone to determine where the best price was to sell his grain, and that almost doubled his income by having that information. Um, so I think those would be kind of two big things.
Awesome. And where is the, I don't know, I don't want to use the word craziest is what's coming to mind, but what's the most just, where have you been that was just like mind blowing and fascinating for whatever reason? I mean, you've just been to so many places that I'm curious about, and I'm just wondering, have you been somewhere where you're just like, whoa, this is just different?
There's a couple countries I visited, like Tajikistan uh,
Hmm.
and the Gambia, where when I was there, they still had kind of a cult of personality around the leader, where you saw
Okay.
pictures of the leader everywhere, and that was a very odd thing to see. Um, because that's not something you really see that much in the West, where uh, have this cult of personality around. And I should say there are places worse than that. I've not been to
I feel like
Turkmenistan,
I feel like the USA has it for a Western country,
but
but
you're not going to see
not as much.
billboards.
But yeah.
Like I went to one of the last trips I took was to Saudi Arabia, and there
Mm,
were lots of billboards with MBS, his father, to show like I am the successor in the long line of Ibn al Saud. So he was like the next logical in succession. You don't see billboards like that.
sure,
There's campaign signs and whatnot, but and I understand the whole cult of personality thing in the US, but it's not quite the same as in other countries. It's like if you don't do it, you go to jail type
sure,
thing.
sure. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm aware of that. In Dubai, I mean, in the UAE, there's certainly. I mean, everything. I think every single hotel has the pictures of the sheikhs in the frames, and lots of business establishments, and you do see things along the highway and so on, with the images of the leaders. But I haven't been to. I'm curious about Tajikistan because all the Stan countries I'm interested in because I don't know many people who have visited them, um, and I'm just fascinated. I was talking to someone not so long ago who was telling me about. I was speaking to a fellow musician. This was actually when I was in Nashville, and he was telling me that he had done a concert in Ashgabat, and he was telling me all about Ashgabat, which is in,
I think that's
oh gosh, is that
Turkmenistan.
that's Turkmenistan, is it?
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
And he was telling me about it and showing me photos, and I just became sort of fascinated by the city, which is all just like white marble. Like I think it's the city with the most white marble in the world. It's just all these white buildings, and it's so quiet. It's like this whole city, but the roads are almost always empty. and I've seen videos of like people on YouTube and they're kind of walking around the city and there's nobody around and there's just all these giant statues and it just looked really weird. But I met a guy who actually performed there and I was just like, man, like I haven't even heard of this. Like I'm fascinated, but
You should
I'm
definitely
curious about
go. It's gotten
yeah,
a
I'd love
lot
to.
easier. So, when
Okay.
I went to Central Asia, it was a pain because they had these really onerous visa requirements, and since then, most of the countries, except for Turkmenistan, have gotten rid of them. And so
Mm,
tourism in places like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan has increased quite a bit because it's so much
okay.
easier to go there. And it's relatively cheap once you're on the ground. And these places are beautiful. If you go up
Okay.
and say the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan, it's gorgeous. And there are trips and tours you can take where you can stay with some of the nomadic people there in a yurt. And lots of experiences. I was in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and it was a surprisingly modern city. Like I was
Mm,
saying, most of the world is not as backwards as people make it out to be. And what you'll also see in a lot of these places is a lot of remnants from the Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet
mm,
architecture. I remember we went through this little town in Kyrgyzstan, and they still had this decaying stadium that was built during Soviet times with like the Olympic logo and stuff on it. And so there's a lot of that still there. And it's one of the parts of the world where you're not going to be able to speak English very much. Uh,
mm.
Russian, like if you go to Eastern Europe now, I'd say if you're under 40 or 50, most people are going to know English instead of Russian. But in Central Asia, English never had a reason to become learned and become popularized
Yeah. So I know from your blog that am I right in saying you only speak English
fluently. Um,
fluently? Okay.
I can get by in a bunch of other languages in terms of can I get something to eat? Can I get a room?
Sure.
Um, Basic things like that. I think you should always learn hello, please, thank you in any language to at least make it look like you're trying. But the reality is, the international language of travel and tourism is English.
Mhm.
And, in Dubai, how well can you get along in English without knowing Arabic?
Oh, completely fine in Dubai. I was curious in all the places you've traveled to if there was anywhere where you felt like that was an impediment or barrier.
It's when you go to rural areas that it tends to be the biggest problem. So, if traveling in Japan, I had no problem in major cities. English is taught in Japanese schools. Many people are hesitant to speak it because they feel they don't do it well, but they can at least understand the basics and some basic reading and writing. But when I went to one of the an outer island that gets very few visitors, um, Yakushima. I went to a hotel and nobody spoke English. But again, it was easy to figure out because what is a tourist going to do at a hotel? They're going to get a place to stay and they're going to get something to eat. And one of the things I found you can do in any language is spend money. That people will always find out a way to take money from you. And if you've ever been to like a market or a bazaar or something, a lot of merchants will have like a cheapo calculator or something on their phone where they will at least type in and show you the price because numbers are pretty universal.
Money talks for sure. Gary, where are some major places that you have not yet been to?
Oh, there's several. So the biggest holes in my resume, I have not been to Jamaica.
Okay.
There's no reason I haven't not been to Jamaica. I just never got. I've been to all the tiny little islands in the Caribbean, but I've not been to Jamaica and Cuba. I have not been to Nicaragua in Central America. I have not been to Peru or Colombia in South America, both of which are very easy to visit. I just haven't done it. I haven't been to Nepal or Bhutan. I haven't been to Algeria or Tunisia. The only places in Europe I've not been are Ukraine and Moldova. And then a bunch of like smaller Central African Sahara countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan. I haven't been to those either. So there's still places for me to visit. Oh, and I've been to China, but China is huge. And there's a lot to China that I haven't seen, and a lot of India I still haven't seen. I've been to a couple states in India, but there's a lot more that I could go visit. Uh, and to put it into perspective, a lot of people say like, "Well, how many countries have you visited?" But within that, like I've been to every state of Germany. I've been to every US state twice. I've been to every Canadian province. I've been to every Australian state. I've been to every South African state. So I've done a lot of travel within places. It's not like you just land at the airport, claim victory, and leave. It's actually exploring a lot of these countries. So a lot of those countries, they're a country, but I kind of think of them mentally as multiple countries. That there's a very big difference between southern India, where they may speak Tamil, versus the Bengal, versus what you're going to find in the far north.
Mhm. Is there anywhere that you wouldn't go?
Well, I can't really go to North Korea right now because I think
Sure.
it's been made off limits. And I think it's becoming more difficult as an American to go to Iran.
Okay.
Um, so it's not that I wouldn't go. I think the only places I wouldn't go is if there is some conflict going on where I would be targeted because of who I am.
Got it.
And I probably would have no desire to go to Russia right now
Yeah,
because
fair
when I
enough.
went to Russia, I was just harassed. You know, I remember I landed in or I came by boat into St. Petersburg, and they were just like going through my passports, like, so you're in the American military? Like, no.
Mm.
And they were trying to trick me into saying it, like, people in the military say what? And even when I was leaving, they were trying to get me to say that so they could detain me or something. I don't know.
Oh, wow.
But it
When
was
was that? When was that?
before the fighting in Ukraine started.
Yeah.
So this would have been around 2019, I think, 2018.
Mm. It's interesting. I've had two almost opportunities to go to Russia in the last few years. I was supposed to go there actually in 2020 before all of the lockdowns and stuff kicked off. I actually had a booking there to speak at an event, and then it got postponed once, and then eventually it just had to get canceled because they were bringing in speakers from different countries, and with all the chopping and changing and restrictions and everything around COVID, it just became too much of a hassle. So that one didn't happen. And then actually a couple weeks ago, funnily enough, like last week, last week or 2 weeks ago, I actually had an opportunity to go out there, um, and I did strongly consider it, but I was just like, I don't know if when I just kind of factor everything in, I was just like, I don't know if this is the wisest move for me right now. I'm sure it would be fine. It was more of a thing of like, I don't want to concern my family. Like I wasn't particularly concerned for myself.
I think if you get invited on some official thing, it's probably going to be a very different experience. What I should have done that I didn't do is that when they were hosting the World Cup, they had visa-free travel, and I probably should have taken advantage of that. That you could have stayed in the country for an extended period of time, like a couple months, and just traveled wherever you wanted to. And I should have done it at that time, but I didn't.
Yeah. Where is still high on your list? Is there a particular place so that you feel like a strong pull towards, not just because you want to tick the box and say you've been there, but is there somewhere you haven't been where you're like, man, I'd actually really like to check that place out?
Machu Picchu, Beijing, and Shanghai, I should say. Uh, but then I'd also really like to do some stuff in more remote parts of China. China's a big country, and most of their population center is in the east. But when you go west, you get into the desert, you get into the Himalayas. There's a lot of really amazing stuff that you can see. Um, there's a ancient Roman city in the Algerian desert called Timgad that I would love to visit because it's so well preserved. Unlike a lot of Roman ruins where people lived there for centuries after the Romans left, this was pretty much just abandoned. And so you can still see perfectly the outlines of all the streets laid out in a grid. And it's one of the best preserved Roman cities. Leptis Magna in Libya. That would be a place that would be very high on my list. Um, the um, there's some places in Botswana that I would love to visit. Um, the Okavango Delta, and I would love. There are places I'd love to go back to as well. Like one of my favorite countries is Namibia. Namibia is so underrated. It's just a fantastic place to visit. very safe. They've never had any civil wars or anything like that. They speak English. The Namib Desert is gorgeous. I had the pleasure of spending 5 days out in the Namib, kind of roaming around, and it's a remarkable place that I would love to go back to.
Awesome, awesome. You know, you've just put Namibia on my list. It's not somewhere I'd ever really thought about that much before, but maybe I should add that one.
And the other thing you can do now, and so one of the other places I visited that has become much easier to visit is the island of Saint Helena. And Saint Helena was where Napoleon was exiled. And when I went, you and for centuries before, you couldn't fly there because it's a very rugged island. So I had to take a ship from Cape Town, and it was 5 days sailing to get there. Then you had to spend a week there, and then it was 5 days sailing to get back. But they built an airport now. It was under construction when I was there, and so now you can fly in. And there's a flight that goes, I believe it's Johannesburg uh, to Namibia, and then Namibia to St. Helena. So you can fly there, and it's a very easy trip. And St. Helena is a fascinating place as well, and gets very, very few visitors.
What's the population of St. Helena? Do you know approximately?
About 4,000, I want to say.
Oh wow.
The people there are called saints, and I think there are more of them that live in Swindon than live on St. Helena right now. Um,
Okay.
I think it's
Interesting.
Swindon that the large population of them went to. Um, but it
Swindon,
really
as in
can't.
Swindon in the UK?
Yeah,
Oh, okay. All
because
right.
it's a British territory.
Yeah.
So, and in many respects, a lot of these British territories, like the Falklands, they tend to be more British than the British
Mhm.
because, especially in the Falklands, they really no one that lives there wants to be a part of Argentina, so they tend to kind of go overboard on the Britishness. So, I remember going to a pub and they had the Union Jack everywhere and everything. Um, what's interesting about St. Helena is that there was never a native population on St. Helena. So when Europeans first arrived, there was no one there. So the English eventually took it over. And then uh, when they banned slavery in 1835, it was a place where when they were capturing slave ships, they would bring the people that were captured to St. Helena temporarily before bringing them back to the African mainland. And some of them just stayed there. And then in the early 20th
Mm.
century, they brought in Chinese laborers to work in some of the fields. And so you had a very small island with a very small population of European, African, and Asian people, and they all just intermarried. And so the entire island is the most mixed race place I've ever seen. And you can literally see the history of the island in the faces of everybody that lives there. And that's the only place where I can really see something like that has happened, where you can the one guy I talked to, he was, I guess, the equivalent of the mayor or the leader of the island. And we
Mhm.
got to talk to him for a bit. And I just remember him saying, "Oh, yeah, my great grandpa, he was a Chinaman." And it's when
Fair.
you live in a community like that, I don't think people had the ability to be that bigoted when it was that small. So that's what they ended up with. And I've never seen a place like that on Earth.
Fascinating. Tell me about Palau, because I'm actually a resident of Palau, but I haven't been there. So I'm curious because you're the first person I've spoken to who I think has actually visited.
Okay, Juan, hey, do you scuba dive?
I've never been scuba diving, but I'd be
Okay,
open to learning.
Palau is the best place in the world to scuba dive, hands down. It is so
Okay.
it's a very small country. It is a they have a compact of free association with the United States, which means they have very close ties. So literally, they're part of the U.S. Postal Service. So you can mail stuff to Palau for the same cost as mailing it anywhere in the United States.
Interesting.
They speak English. Population is about 20,000 people, but they rely so heavily on tourism, especially from Japan, China, the US for scuba diving, that they have done more to protect their reefs and the ecosystem around the island than any country in the world. Like they've really, really, um, doubled down on that. And they have some fascinating places called jellyfish lakes. Jellyfish
Okay.
lakes are in the middle of these limestone islands, and water has seeped through the limestone to fill these pools in the middle of the island, and jellyfish got in. But there's no predators. So they eventually evolved away their stingers. And so you can go swimming in these lakes with tens of thousands of jellyfish all around you. And you may have seen photos like this. If you've ever seen, they're about as big as your fist.
Mhm.
Um, and when we went there, so it was me, I was the only American, and a bunch of Australians. And if you're Australian, you learn to be afraid of jellyfish. Natural thing. They have box
Yeah.
as a stupid American from the Midwest who never saw saltwater till he was 21, I have no built-in fear of jellyfish. So I just jumped in and started swimming, rubbing up against the jellyfish. And the Australians eventually went in, but they're perfectly safe. But it's just gorgeous, and it's a surreal experience
Hmm.
being in the water with all these jellyfish around you. And you don't have to scuba dive for this. This is just snorkeling or even just swimming. But
Okay.
so, did you like buy a Palau residency?
Yeah, they have this like digital residency thing, and so like I guess through all my social media stuff and whatever, sometimes people just reach out to me with random opportunities and offers and things like that. And so someone reached out to me who I think was part of this digital residency program, and they offered it to me as someone who's I don't know, has a significant following online, um, and I was a bit confused. I was like, is there is there a catch here? Do you need me to do this or this or this? And they're like, no, we just kind of want to give it to you. So I was like, okay, cool. So I'm a Palau resident, but I have not yet stepped foot in the country.
Oh, Palau is the Pacific in general is my favorite part of the world. Um, because so few people go there. The vast majority of the tourists that visit these islands tend to be from Australia and New Zealand. So when they get someone else, they're always kind of surprised to meet them. I remember I was in Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, and I woke up and they were watching Monday Night Football, even though it was the morning because they're on the other side of the time zone. And there was a bunch of these surly looking guys, and they were all looking at me, and they're like, "What are you doing here?" They eventually came over, and I was like, "Well, I'm traveling around the world," and they're like, "Really? Come have breakfast with us." And it was great. They were like, this one guy had been a merchant marine and sailed around the world, and this other guy was an engineer, and he retired, and his dream was to just go live on a beach with a solar panel. And so he came to the Marshall Islands and basically did that. And it was just this eclectic, fascinating group of guys that were all just watching football. So
Man, that's fascinating. I mean, I know you must just have like a gigantic repository in your brain of stories. Do you find that I know you obviously document so much, given that you're a photographer and also that you do your blogging and your podcast. Do you find it easy to recall all of the different places, or do you think that after traveling so much that do they start to do they start to blur at all?
no, I actually wrote about this on my blog when I started traveling. That it was strange because I could tell you every day what I was doing. And before I started traveling, everything blurred together because every day was the same. You get up, you go to work, even today, I couldn't tell you like how the days are separate. But when you're traveling, it's very different. You remember everything. And so I can probably tell you more about that 10 years of my life than any other 10 years of my life, where, the distinction between days and what you're doing on those days doesn't stick out nearly as much. So, and sometimes it's even little things, songs that I heard. I remember I was in New Zealand. I was in Auckland in 2011 for the Rugby World Cup, and I heard Someone I Used to Know by Gautier at this cafe. This was before it became a hit outside. He's Kiwi, and I was like, "This is a really catchy song," and I took notice of that. And then when I heard it later, I was like, "Oh, I heard that before when I was in New Zealand. And this guy's from New Zealand." And there's a lot of little things like that that, for whatever reason, stick out. I remember being at an internet cafe in Queenstown, New Zealand, my first time there. This was in 2007. And I just heard this song by a group called Groove Armada, and it stuck with me ever since. And so I have these associations in my head with different places and different songs or different smells or sights, where even in the course of a day, I'll be like, "Oh, that reminds me of this place. That candle reminds me of this temple I visited in Taipei," or something like that. Um, yeah, if there's some sort of psychological or mental explanation for it, I'd love to hear it, but I definitely can recall more traveling than I can from other things.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And I guess if I think of I've been to 45 or 46 countries and 100 plus different cities. And actually, if I think of my own memory and recollection, yeah, I can remember that particularly, certain days and places. Like, yeah, I could recall it better than, I don't know, if I'm just kind of if I'm staying and put in one place and I'm just kind of at home and in normal surroundings where it starts to blur together because you're just in routine. Yeah, I guess that certainly makes sense. Of Out of all given this whole experience of travel, what would you say is the most important lesson that you've personally learned from it all?
The ability to adapt is more important than the ability to plan. I know a lot of people, they go on a trip and they try to plan everything out down to the last detail. And I don't know if you've heard the famous Mike Tyson quote, everyone has a plan until you get hit in the face. You're going to get hit in the face when you travel. It might be a delayed flight, it might be rain, it might be weather. Something's going to happen that's going to screw up your plans. So I never plan that far ahead. Oftentimes, I would just have a ticket for the next place and just I had no particular. Sometimes I didn't even have a ticket out, or if I did, it was something that I could change quite easily. Uh, so I had, I was flexible with my options. I would arrive somewhere and you can read whatever guidebook you want. But then if you're staying at a hostel, which I always recommend because it's very easy to meet people, especially other travelers, and maybe they just came from the place that you wanted to go and they will know it's like, well, this road got washed out or we stayed at this place and we really liked it and it was cheap. So you're going to get this kind of immediate on the ground advice. Um, and quite frankly, it's not even a travel thing. Even in business, you can get bogged down in a business plan if you're starting some sort of new enterprise. And conditions are going to change. Opportunities will appear, problems will appear, and you need to be able to adapt to those quickly rather than trying to stick to the plan. So that's kind of the thing that I've always stuck with. That it's not to say you shouldn't have a plan or at least have a goal, but you need to be flexible in whatever you're doing to achieve that goal.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant lesson. I can definitely relate to that. So, Gary, what is next for you?
Right now, I have a daily podcast, and that has taken up so much of my time. When the pandemic hit and the travel industry kind of imploded, I shifted to a daily podcast, and I consciously did not do a travel show. But I did something that allowed me to use all of my experiences from traveling in the podcast. So it's more of a history show or an educational show. I have degrees in 5 different subjects, uh, plus all the world travel. So I have a pretty broad knowledge base, and the show allows me to do that. But I'm basically writing a 2,000 word term paper every day. And that is what the show is. So it's become very popular because I'm doing something that no one else is really doing, but it requires a lot of work. So I'm probably going to be taking the show on the road, at least to record in other places. So I was going to go to Australia or New Zealand this winter, and I didn't do it because the winter really wasn't that bad. But I'll probably do that again. But it's easy for me because it's just a podcast. I can go pretty much anywhere, bring a microphone. I just need to have basic internet, and I can get it done. So I don't think I'm ever going to travel like I did, which was moving around quite a bit. But I'm definitely going to be hitting the road again and maybe revisiting some places that I enjoyed in the past. And I should add, as an American right now, this is a great time to travel because the dollar is very strong. When I was first in Australia, for example, it was at parity with the US dollar. This was in 2008. And it was really expensive to travel in Australia. So I kind of want to get my money back against the house by going and returning now that it's like 62 cents to the dollar.
That's a good way to put it. Gary, where can people find and follow you online?
Wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, just search for Everything Everywhere Daily, and that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Gary, man, thanks for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. you've actually inspired me to travel to even more places, and you've put a few additional ones on my radar that I wasn't thinking of as high priority before. So thank you for that.
Yeah, get in the car, go to Oman. You'll love it. Go up to the Musandam Peninsula, which is that little bit of Oman that's separate, that juts into the Strait of Hormuz. There's a fjord up there, and you think of fjords as Norway, and that is a very cool place to visit, especially if you have a car so you can drive around.
Okay, awesome. Recommendation taken. Thank you, Gary. Really appreciate it.